Okay, so the narrative, again, is America is evil. America hasn't listened. Every inequality in America is due to inequity. This comes out in the stupidest possible fashion in a column by a person named Savala Trepzinski, the executive director of the Center for Social Justice at the UC Berkeley School of Law. She has a book about race, gender, and the body, published by Simon & Schuster in 2021. I'm sure it will be a massive bestseller. It is called Black and Brown People Have Been Protesting for Centuries. It's white people who are responsible for what happens next. What I love about that title, particularly, is the idea that white people had nothing to do with, ending slavery. White people had nothing to do with ending Jim Crow. That basically there's this stark dichotomy between the races, which of course is not true in terms of there are lots of good white people and lots of bad white people. There are lots of great black people and lots of bad black people. It turns out that individuals are both good and bad. This is a thing that happens. But according to this article at Time Magazine, the way that you know you're white is that you exist in opposition to other groups. She says, how do you know you're white? I'm talking to 100 law students. The room is racially diverse and full of people who have gotten into top law schools. They're committed to making racial equality a cornerstone of their work. They tend to think about race in their daily lives. They've chosen to attend this evening lecture about the problematic ways race is baked into American law and legal pedagogy. But not a single hand goes up to answer my question, and this matters. You know why no one raised their hand? Because they're afraid you're going to yell at them. Because if you say, I know I'm white because of the color of my skin, you're going to say, no, you're not acknowledging the systems and hierarchies of race that have made you so powerful. And if you say, I don't think of myself as white, I think of myself as Jewish, says, well, you don't understand that you are white because of the systems of privilege and power, right? No matter what you say, there's no right answer. There's no right answer. According to this professor over at UC Berkeley School of Law, the way that you know you're white in the end is because you are part of whiteness, right? So you should be guilty because you're white. She says, white students often stop short, unable to identify and articulate the cultural, political, economic, and historic clues that tell them they are part of whiteness, let alone what being part of whiteness truly means. I let the silence grow. It gets uncomfortable. Then I step in to suggest that this phenomenon is a significant part of America's problem with race. So if you answer, she yells at you because you don't understand your own whiteness unless you shout that you are guilty for all of America's problems. And then if you don't answer, that's also the problem. So this particular narrative is the endpoint of the academic nonsense that suggests collective responsibility for individual sins. And it's pretty disgusting. Okay, so George W. Bush put out a statement yesterday about the protests, and he bought into some of the nostrums that have been promoted here. Now, he starts off and he talks about the brutal suffocation of George Floyd. Again, we all agree. Then he says, we have resisted the urge to speak out because this is not the time for us to lecture. It is time for us to listen. It is time for America to examine our tragic failures. And as we do, we will also see some of our redeeming strengths. Okay, what are our tragic failures? It remains a shocking failure that many African Americans, especially young African American men, are harassed and threatened in their own country. Okay, can we have some data on that or some specific people who are doing that? Because that's a crime. Can we have... So this is just George W. Bush trying to calm the anger. It's the same thing as police officers taking a knee with protesters. It's not that police officers believe that they themselves are systemically racist or that they are racist at all. It's that police officers are trying to quell the anger by legitimizing the anger. There's a problem, however. I understand the short-term strategy, but there's a problem. When you legitimize the anger by also legitimizing a lie, namely that America is in a horrible, terrible place for Black Americans to live, that Black Americans cannot experience equality, that Black Americans are innately under the thumb of white America, there are going to be predictable results that do not end up working inside the political system. So George W. Bush puts out this statement along with Laura Bush. He says, this tragedy and a lot of similar tragedies raises a long overdue question. How do we end systemic racism in our society? The only way to see ourselves in a true light is to listen to the voices of so many who are hurting and grieving. Those who set out to silence those voices do not understand the meaning of America or how it becomes a better place. Not sure who's trying to silence the voices, but are we allowed to say that if you suggest that America is a systemically racist place without any evidence whatsoever of actual policy, that maybe you need to provide some evidence? That's not silencing. That's asking for evidence. Again, anger is not evidence. And anecdotal evidence is a form of evidence, but it is not statistical evidence. The buying into the narrative that America broadly writ is guilty for the sins of people like Derek Chauvin, that every one of those instances can be broadened out and blamed on American hierarchies of power, is a trope that has a predictable endpoint, and the predictable endpoint is the disintegration of the country. That is the predictable endpoint. When you see people as a member of a group, everyone is a member of a group that is either guilty or innocent. The only way you can expiate your guilt, by the way, is by posting some sort of black box on your Twitter or Instagram. That's how you do your sacrifice in the temple to expiate your sins so you can get forgiveness. This is not the way that a country comes together. This is the way a country falls apart, by holding people accountable for things they did not do. and for holding the system accountable for laws that no longer exist. If you're going to talk about systemic racism, there are really only a couple ways to define systemic racism. One is practices and laws that are innately discriminatory. Jim Crow, housing bias, right? The things that are innately discriminatory. We all oppose them, and they are against federal law. Okay, then there is a second way to define systemic discrimination, and that is disparate impact. Disparate impact is the idea that if you pass a law and has a disparate impact on one group, meaning one group is harder hit than another group, that this is an element of racism. I will not endorse that version of systemic racism because every single law that has ever been passed in human history impacts groups differently. The question is whether the law is directed at the group. But you see the conflation, right? The conflation is, okay, if Black Americans by and large are poorer than white Americans, then that must be because of systemic racism. We can't look at any of the other factors. If more Black Americans on a population level adjusted basis are shot by the police than white Americans, then we immediately have to announce that this is an aspect of American racism. We can't look to any other factor. The simple inequality is the inequity. The fact that group statistics are not identical across groups is evidence that the system is discriminating in favor of certain people against other people. Perfect example of this sort of bizarre and unfounded logic today in the New York Times. Minneapolis police use force against Black people at 7 times the rate of whites. Hey, now, the first question for anybody who sees that headline is, okay, so are the Minneapolis police encountering more Black criminals than white criminals? And are those based on actual phone calls from people reporting crimes? Right? Because let me give you another example. Virtually all Americans who go to prison for violent crimes are men. Virtually none are women. Does that mean that the system is unequal with regard to men and women, or does it mean that men are committing more crimes than women in terms of violent crimes? Wouldn't you want to know that before you declare the system innately inequitable, innately systemically discriminatory against men? The answer is, of course you would. So if the question is, how many people are being shot by police? The second question should be, okay, and how many people committed crimes? Because if you look at the Washington Post database of how many people in America were Black and unarmed and shot by police in 2019, this is the Washington Post database, the answer in 2019 was 9. If you want to talk about the number of Black Americans who were shot who are unarmed and who are not fleeing from police, the answer is 3. Does that sound like the extermination of Black people across the country? It does not. Nowhere in this New York Times piece, not a single place, do they actually talk about differential crime rates by race. Now, again, that's not racist. It is not racist to point out that there are differential crime statistics any more than it is racist to point out that there are differential statistics when it turns to police officers shooting people. A statistic is a statistic. Statistics are not racist. They are just statistics. But apparently, if you point out that a disproportionate share of crime is committed by young Black men, this is racist. But if you point out that a disproportionate share of young Black men are shot by police, then this is woke. How about both of those are stats and they are related stats, but we're not allowed to point that out. We just have to attribute the disparity, the second disparity, not the first. The second disparity, we are supposed to attribute to broad-scale American racism. So we have this long, long article about the evils of the Minneapolis police. My favorite quote in this is from David Schultz, professor at Hamline University in St. Paul. He says, the disparities in the use of force in Minneapolis parallel large racial gaps in vital measures in the city, like income, education, and unemployment. He says it just mirrors the disparities of so many other things in which Minneapolis comes in very badly. Okay, might it mirror the disparity in crime statistics? Might it? Wouldn't that be like the number one question, considering you called the cops? This is not about random white Americans shooting random Black Americans. This is about the police who are called in to deal with crime. Wouldn't you want to know what the calls actually said before you declare that the police are racist? If somebody calls up the police and says, you know, my neighbor just murdered my other neighbor. Both of them were Black. And the police come and they get in an armed confrontation with the murderer. Is that a racist incident, or is that the police doing their job? That's the big question. The question isn't how many Black Americans are being shot by police. The question is how many Black Americans are being unjustifiably shot by police. And how does that compare with the number of white Americans being unjustifiably shot by police? And more, because that would implicate racism. And more broadly, how many Americans are broadly being unjustifiably shot by police is an issue of police brutality. Okay, and that one we all agree on. But instead, we have to drive this narrative over and over and over again that every inequality is due to the innate evils of the United States. And so you saw CNN put up a piece today about racial inequalities in the United States in terms of the wealth gap. It is true that there are certain disparities in the wealth gap that are attributable to historic injustices, like redlining, for example, because so much of wealth is concentrated in home ownership, for example. But it would not explain, racism would not explain, the continuing income disparity between Black Americans and white Americans, particularly because you know where there is no income disparity. If you look at parental income, if your parents are poor, you are not going to have as high an income generally speaking, after the same period of time as somebody who's born in a rich family, which is not a particular surprise, right? You're going to grow up in a richer community. You're going to have more connections. Right? That is a class issue. That is not a race issue. But let's say that you're a black woman who is born in a wealthy black family versus a white woman born in a wealthy white family. How exactly does that turn out? Is that racism? Well, it turns out there is no income gap between black and white women raised in similar households. None. It's only among males, which might implicate behavior because it turns out that black women are also black. So again, like statistics, I know have been verboten here because we're trying to drive a narrative. It is wrong for people to try and buy their way out of conflict by buying into narratives that are going to create deeper conflicts over the nature of America. Because again, the idea that America is systemically racist and broadly racist just allows people to, number one, avoid naming and shaming and being specific about policies and people who are doing bad things, and instead allows them to say the entire system is guilty, therefore tear down the entire system. And if you don't say tear down the entire system, then you're a racist. That is the implication of the narrative that is being drawn. Okay, in just a second, I'm going to get to some actual police statistics, and we'll talk about systemic police racism. We'll also talk about this attempt to buy penance, particularly by woke white people who are attempting to demonstrate their bona fides by mouthing platitudes. First, let's talk about the actual statistics. So Heather McDonald, who has spent her life studying the statistics on police brutality and racial disparities, she has a piece in the Wall Street Journal that is worth reading. Again, we can acknowledge that people are angry. We can acknowledge that people have anecdotal evidence of the police mistreating them. We can even acknowledge that if you are a black person living in a high crime area, there is a better chance that you had a bad run-in with a police officer than there is if you are a black person living in a high income area, or if you're a white person living in a high income area, or a white person living in a low crime area. Right? The area is determinative, and the amount of interaction between police officers and people of a particular race is determinative too. My guess is that you could find quite a bit of anecdotal evidence of police abusing Latinos in East Los Angeles, where there are high crime rates and a lot of Hispanic populations. Okay, but here's Heather McDonald talking about the myth of systemic police racism. She says, this charge of systemic police bias was wrong during the Obama years. It remains so today. However, sickening the video of Floyd's arrest, it isn't representative of the 375 million annual contacts police officers have with civilians. A solid body of evidence finds no structural bias in the criminal justice system with regard to arrests, prosecution, or sentencing. Crime and suspect behavior, not race, determine most police actions. In 2019, police officers fatally shot 1,004 people, most of whom were armed or otherwise dangerous. African Americans were about a quarter of those killed by cops last year, 235, a ratio that has remained stable since 2015. Okay, so first of all, we should note just right off the bat that police officers fatally shot 235 black people last year. There are 30 million black Americans. Does that sound like a campaign of extermination by police officers against black people? It does not. That share of black victims is less than what black crime rates would predict, since police shootings are a function of how often officers encounter armed and violent suspects. In 2018, the last year for which such data have been published, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders in the U.S. and committed about 60% of robberies, although they are 13% of the population. In fact, if you actually want to break down that subset even further, you shouldn't really use 13% of the population as a substitute because really you're talking about young black men. It is not black women who are committing homicide and robbery, right? It's a smaller percentage of the population even than that. The police fatally shot 9 unarmed blacks and 19 unarmed whites in 2019, according to the Washington Post. That is down from 38 and 32 in 2015. The Post defines unarmed broadly to include such cases as a suspect in Newark, New Jersey, who had a loaded handgun in his car during a police chase. That guy was still considered unarmed by the Post. In 2018, there were 7,400 black homicide victims. Assuming a comparable number of victims last year, those 9 unarmed black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African Americans killed in 2019. By contrast, a police officer is 18 and a half times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is likely to be killed by a police officer. On Memorial Day weekend in Chicago alone, 10 African Americans were killed in drive-by shootings. Such routine violence has continued. This past weekend, 80 Chicagoans were shot in drive-by shootings, 21 fatally, the victims overwhelmingly black. Police shootings are not the reason that blacks are dying of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Criminal violence is. The latest in a series of studies undercutting the claim of systemic police bias was published in August 2019 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The researchers found that the more frequently officers encounter violent suspects from any given racial group, the greater the chance that a member of that group will be fatally shot by the police officer. There is no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being shot by the police. A 2015 Justice Department analysis of the Philly Police Department found that white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. Research by Harvard economist Roland Fryer found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. So none of this matters, though, because the narrative must be driven. And the easiest way for the narrative to be driven is to bully people into buying the narrative and to repeating the narrative. So yesterday, I drove down Ventura Boulevard in the Valley because there were threats online that there was going to be rioting and looting in Encino and in Sherman Oaks. And I would say a quarter of the businesses were boarded up. There are a bunch of businesses that were boarded up. People had boarded up their windows, so they didn't want them to be smashed and rocks thrown at the windows. And I would say of those, about half of them had BLM spray painted on the Black Lives Matter spray painted on the plywood, or Justice for George Floyd painted on the plywood, or something like that. And let's be real about this. Do you think that they spray painted that on the plywood because they're out joining the protests? Or do you think they painted that on the plywood because they're under the strange misimpression that people who loot their stores give a damn about George Floyd or about racial justice? They were attempting to avoid their store windows being broken. I saw several of these stores had signs up on the window that said minority-owned businesses, which, by the way, is an unbelievable statement. Basically, don't break my windows if I'm your race. If you are of another race, break the guy's next door windows. Go ahead and do that. Hey, that is immoral. It is immoral. Can you imagine if there were an anti-black riot and people were putting up store window signs that said white-owned business? That would be racist. By the way you know this is a racially driven riot is because people are putting up exactly those kinds of signs, right? Otherwise, the sign wouldn't work. If it were not racially driven, then why are you putting up a race-based sign on who owns the business? The attempt by retailers, by businesses, by corporations to buy off the mob, because this is the other corollary of this. Once you've declared America as racist and systemically racist, once you have gone to the extent of saying that Target and Best Buy, that these are just extensions of American hierarchies of power built on slavery and Jim Crow, once you say all that, there's only one way for those corporations to get off the schneid, so to speak, and that is for them to put out a mea culpa. It's for them to say, yeah, well, that may have, sure, we're part of the American system, and we agree America is racist, but don't hurt us because we agree with you. We're on your side. So we agree with you. So the most pandering of these statements came from Nordstrom yesterday. So Nordstrom was looted over at the Grove in Los Angeles. Nordstrom put up a statement on its website, quote, "The events of this weekend are one more painful reminder that injustice remains in the world. We can fix the damage to our stores. Windows and merchandise can be replaced. We continue to believe as strongly as ever that tremendous change is needed to address the issues facing black people in our country today." So in other words, keep breaking our windows because you're doing so in the name of justice, but please don't break our windows. We're on your side. That's pretty astonishing stuff. Okay, I'm sorry, woke white people involving themselves in performative virtue signaling so that they will be left alone online or in their business. I'm not sure how that's great for the country. You're not calling for actual changes to policy. You're not backing actual changes to policy. I'd love to see one of these corporations come out in favor of ending qualified immunity. I'd like to see one of these corporations come out, small businesses come out and say, you know what the big problem here is? Police unions. We need to end police brutality. I'd like to see one of these businesses come out and say, you know what one of the big problems here is? That we have too little policing in high crime areas because that leads to continuing levels of crime against people of color in these areas. And that makes it very difficult to invest money in those areas. None of these businesses are going to say any of that because that's actual content. Instead, they're going to virtue signal with sloganeering, hoping they will be left alone. That's what's happening here. We're going to buy into the narrative that blame America writ large, kneel with the protesters, say that systemic racism is responsible for all inequality, and then maybe everybody can get along. That's not the way this is going to go. That's not the way this is going to go. Honestly, the best video of the last 24 hours came courtesy of our friend Ami Horowitz, who's in Minneapolis, and he was in somebody's apartment building. And he took this video of these appear to be frat bros who are giving the thumbs up to protesters who are on the street. So there are a bunch of protesters who are walking along the street. And these frat bros start giving the thumbs up. We're on your side, man. We're on your side. And 5 seconds later, rocks come smashing through the window. It's pretty hilarious. It's in a very sad and tragic fashion. It is hilarious. But they're there giving the thumbs up. We're on your side, man. Filming themselves. And boom, rock comes right through the window. And there it goes. Yep. And we're on your, and the guy begging and pleading, I'm on your side, man. We're on your side. Well, that didn't help, did it? It didn't help, did it?